Have you ever suspected that this world is not what it seems?
Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain?
Something strange?
Something extraordinary?
If not, do you wish you had?
Do you long to experience that which lies beyond the bounds of the mundane world?
Hidden somewhere just beyond the limits of our senses.
If so, then join us as we take you on a journey
That blurs the lines between the normal and the paranormal. Welcome to Paranormalcy.
Reincarnation appears sometimes as a major idea and sometimes in isolated sects or breakaway factions in every religion on Earth. Nobody is certain when or where it actually arose, but it first appeared in writing in the Upanishads in the late Vedic era, which began to carve out the concepts of karma and rebirth and would eventually supplant the ideas of an afterlife and ancestor worship, which were up until that point the common belief. The Upanishads gave rise to Brahmanism, or ancient Hinduism, which would eventually split ideologically into modern Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. As these systems developed, they maintained the same basic idea of karma, rebirth, and an escape from the karmic cycle, but they diverged philosophically from one another on the nature of the soul, suffering being a part of the nature of human life, and what breaking free of the karmic cycle would look like on an individual level. Contemporary to this is the Kabbalistic concept of Gilgul, which refers to the esoteric Jewish belief in the Wheel of Souls. Eventually, these ideas would be picked up by the ancient Greeks in their philosophies of metempsychosis and palingenesis, or the transmigration of the soul. We see it in Orphism, the religion founded by the Greek Orpheus. Orpheus was believed by Aristotle to be mythical, but he was referred to by almost all other sources as a real physical man who lived several generations before Homer. He is most widely known now as a companion to Jason and the Argonauts on their journey to Hades, but he also served as a focal point for this early reincarnation religion, which deified him along with other figures like Dionysus and Persephone, who had also returned from Hades to the world of the living. They believed in suffering as a means to escape the cycle of reincarnation and issued instructions for the dead to retain their memories from their prior lives in the next one. Reincarnation is referenced by Pythagoras, Plutarch, Plato, Pherecydes of Syros, and debatably Socrates. It was thought of by the Romans, and it appears in the Hermetica. Caesar talked about observing it in Gaul, and Valerius Maximus noted that the Gallic Druids believed so deeply in reincarnation that they had a system of money lending where the borrower would repay the lender in the next life, and that at funerals suicides were common so that the two parties could be reincarnated together. This is called suti in Hinduism, and it was commonly practiced by widowed women in order to join their husbands in the afterlife. It even shows itself in Germanic paganism, both in the Eddas and conventions of naming newly born children after the recently deceased. We see it in Sufism, an esoteric branch of the Islamic faith, and in Native American and Asian belief systems. Several early Christian scholars taught versions of reincarnation, sometimes related to their experiences with other belief systems such as Manichaeism, Marcionism, or Catharism, and the Church went to great lengths to obscure these connections through persecution, murder, and the mistranslation or destruction of church records. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for holding these beliefs, yet they persisted and grew more and more common. Modern Gnosticism, Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, Scientology, Wicca, and branches of neo-paganism and spiritualism all hold elements of it.
Like many seemingly paranormal beliefs, past lives and the reincarnation of the soul is one that persists. The rise of spiritualism in the early 19th century revived the centuries-old idea that had, up until then, primarily existed in Eastern mysticism. Early forays into the idea of past lives centered around accessing the Akasha, a term revived by theosophist Madame Blavatsky. In theory, the Akasha is a sort of spiritual universal database of all knowledge, housed within the spirit world and accessible through deep trance. Edgar Cayce, the man known as the Sleeping Prophet, was said to have been able to access information on past lives while under a deep self-induced trance. A man named Asa Roy Martin, a Pennsylvania native, is credited as the first to develop a technique for hypnotic regression, enabling one to recall their past lives while under a deep hypnotic trance. He published a book on the topic in 1942 called Researches in Reincarnation and Beyond. The technique developed by Martin opened the doors for many to witness their own past lives firsthand. While widely rejected by the scientific establishment, these sessions are still widely held to this day and to great effect. My own history on the idea of reincarnation actually began at a very young age. The very moment I learned of the concept, I accepted it without question. With people being born every day and dying every day, it just made intuitive sense to me. Assuming our being is made up of a portion that survives death, it must go somewhere. Moreover, if this essence of who we are leaves after we die, then where does it come from to begin with? This essence, this soul as many would call it, either comes into a fresh newborn as newly created and also ends up filtered out somewhere else after leaving the body. Or is the place our souls come from and the place they exit to not one and the same? If there was a god or some cosmic order, it would make sense that it recycles. I remember my parents used to talk about a feeling they had, a vague recollection that slowly revealed itself the more they explored it. They both claimed that they had lived another life together during the Civil War period. As a child, I was fascinated by this idea, and we watched many Civil War documentaries during this time. Once I learned of past life regression hypnosis, I knew it was something I had to try for myself. There were things about my current life that felt hard to explain. Certain phobias, desires, natural predilections, natural talents. I was beginning to form a theory that there is a portion of who we are that comes from elsewhere, a theory that we will explore further with each episode. My mother was the first to explore past life regression hypnosis. During her session, she recalled being sick and on her deathbed, her young child by her side. That child, she claimed, was me. During the session, she was overcome with emotion over having left me alone in that life to fend for myself. When given the opportunity to experience past life regression myself, I readily agreed. What I experienced would change my view of myself and the world forever.
As we've come into the modern era, we've become more and more enthralled by these ideas, and we've begun to develop theories centered around them, and a lot of major names are interested. Even Carl Sagan considered past life experiences to be a legitimate area of research. Ian Stevenson studied reports of past lives from children for 40 years and published 300 papers and 14 books detailing his findings, including his investigations into birth malformations matching injuries on deceased people who seemed to match the subject's story. And he wasn't just some fringe weirdo, he was the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. He was a professor for 50 years. He founded UVA Med School's Division of Perceptual Studies so that they could study parapsychology, and investigated over 3,000 cases of children who seemed to remember their past lives. He helped found the Society for Scientific Exploration, and in his books he makes some pretty good points. There doesn't appear to be a solid motivation for any of these children to lie. There's nothing to gain and a lot to lose if the family of the reincarnated child is just trying to scam someone. There's also often a large amount of information which would have been extremely difficult to obtain even in today's modern era, but Stevenson started publishing his books in the 1960s, and even if the child were to obtain large amounts of data about the person that they were pretending to be reincarnated from, that wouldn't account for similarities like personality characteristics or birth malformations. In his paper, Some Bodily Malformations Attributed to Previous Lives, he, with his co-authors, discussed further, the mean age for children to begin speaking about a previous life is 37 months, while the mean age of ceasing to talk about this prior life is 7.5 years. 74% of the children refer to how they died, and they note that, quote, violent death figured in these cases much more than the general populations of where they occur. Violent deaths featured in about 51% of these cases, with many of the children exhibiting phobias of people, weapons, or places related to the death that they described. They engaged in behaviors that are unusual for their family or completely unmodeled in their lives, but mirrors their former life in some way, whether it's vocation, religion, or gender. 35% of children appeared with some birth malformation that matched the claims of how they died. Many of them expressed that they preferred their former life and asked to be reunited with their real family. They go on to discuss several case studies. We have the case of a child who was born in the village of Kanoi in India to Sunni Muslims, and had severe malformations in the fingers and toes on each hand and foot, with no history of malformations like these in the medical records of the family. Once able to speak, he began to describe his life and death in a completely different village where he lived with his mother and daughters. He described being the leader of a group of bandits, and that the group began to suspect him of cheating them on the division of stolen property. They tied him up, cut his fingers and toes off with a knife, and left him to die. He said he knew the names of the men that killed him and swore revenge on them, often attempting to make the journey to his former village on foot. From a young age, he knew how to do this, and was able to give detailed instructions on the 95-kilometer journey. Despite knowing that he was a different person, he became very preoccupied with having his daughters be married, and with retrieving stolen property that he had hidden, and with the fact that he had been born to a Muslim family. He would often lament this fact, refusing to participate in prayer or Ramadan, and insisting on identifying himself as a Hindu, celebrating at Hindu festivities, and refusing to eat meat. Upon investigation, the team sent a representative to the town that the child claimed to be from, and they made inquiries which revealed that there had been several bandit groups in the area, and that the leaders had died natural deaths, being killed by angry villagers or the police, but there was only one whose cause of death was debated. His name was Jagan, and his family seemed to be under the impression that he was killed by villagers, but it was rumored in the village that his gang had turned on him. In another case, detailed in his 1993 paper, Birthmarks and Birth Defects Corresponding to Wounds on Deceased Persons, he details the congenital absence of fingers on one hand of a child who said he remembered a former life where he had put his hand into the blades of a fodder chopping machine and lost all of his fingers. In most cases, with this type of birth defect, some of the fingers are simply shortened, but in this case, he had just a couple of stubs. He notes that this condition is extremely rare and has not found another published report of a case. In 1975, he met with a girl in India who lived in a village but began to claim that she lived in Darbhanga, a city of almost 250,000 people. She began making these claims when she was just 3.5 years old. She was able to describe what district she lived in, the name of her son and grandson, the town where her father had lived, and that she had an iron safe at home, owned a sword that she slept near, and had a pet snake that she fed milk to. She said that her son worked with a hammer. The family was able to go to Darbhanga and find a woman who matched the description that had died 5 years before this girl was born. Stevenson even documented a series of Burmese children who reportedly lived as Japanese soldiers and were killed in Burma during the Second World War, and displayed distinctly Japanese inclinations, often against Burmese cultural norms. Ian Stevenson's research was so influential that he received a $1 million grant from physicist and attorney Chester Carlson in 1968. That's equivalent to almost $9 million today, and his research is continued to this day by the people that he inspired at UVA. And sure, we still can't 100% prove that reincarnation is real, but we can prove that there are correlations which don't make sense without some mechanism like it, without the human soul and consciousness being a separate thing from the physical body which goes somewhere when we die. We have Duncan McDougall's 21 grams experiment, where he weighed human bodies before and after death and found out that his subjects lost 21 grams of weight after they died. We have first-hand accounts from people who have left their bodies and come back able to recall in detail what others were doing in the room while they were unconscious. We have hundreds of case studies from Ian Stevenson where children recalled specific details about former lives that they lived. Past lives, out-of-body experiences, and having access to information that one personally hasn't obtained are all things that have been studied and employed by the CIA in things like the Gateway Process, or any of their numerous other studies and programs dedicated to out-of-body experiences and remote viewing. They found that out-of-body experiences can be easily induced through the use of dissociative hallucinogenic drugs, meditation, sensory input extremes, G-forces, emotional and physical trauma, electrical stimulation, and brainwave synchronization. A 1983 CIA report on the techniques employed by the Gateway Process explains that it utilizes meditation techniques coupled with sound in order to induce a state where the EEG patterns of both brain hemispheres are simultaneously equal in amplitude and frequency. This alters the consciousness, quote, moving it outside of the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers." End quote. In this state, people are capable of remote viewing, healing their bodies, and travel between the past and the future. The techniques were developed by Robert Monroe, founder of the Monroe Institute, which works with UVA, and was partnered with their Division of Perceptual Studies. The Monroe Institute studied this at length and taught the entire process to an estimated 20,000 participants during its first 30 years of operation. And these reports don't refer to hypotheticals, but rather to fully researched techniques which have been employed and have allowed real people to escape their bodies and enter a timeless realm where they have access to information and can observe the physical world. Again, we see legitimate and well-respected researchers talking about consciousness displacement with such authority that the US government wanted to utilize that knowledge.
The first experience I had in recalling past lives of mine came during my very first past life regression session. In this, there was a group of us all going under hypnosis together, and we were told that we would visit 3 different lives. I had never been hypnotized before, so I really didn't know what to expect. While I wanted to believe it possible, there was a part of me that remained skeptical. When delving into mysteries of this magnitude, a level head is required as much as an open mind. And so, after being led into a trance and guided in my first past life experience, I was genuinely surprised at what I saw. Any good hypnotist will avoid leading questions, as false memories can easily be implanted in the more pliant minds. And so the hypnotherapist asked the most basic of questions, starting with asking us what we were wearing. The experience of recalling a past life for me was hazy, a bit like a dream. And so, the clothes that I saw myself in seemed like a ridiculous Donald Duck-style sailor suit, white with blue trim. And for some reason, my mind wanted to reject this. I thought to myself, this can't be right. And yet, despite all my resistance, the image persisted. Finally, I relented and decided to humor the vision and see where it would take me. When asked what activity I was engaged in at the time, I could see that I was tightening a large bolt with a wrench. As I looked up, I could see that it was a large gun turret on a Navy battleship. This particular turret was one of the forward ones, and I just happened to be tinkering with it on the starboard side of the ship. As more questions were asked, my vision bounced from scene to scene. I could see the name of the ship stenciled into the side, the USS Mississippi. When asked what I ate, I was shown a scene in a mess hall holding a steel lunch tray. A baked potato unceremoniously dropped onto my tray with an audible thunk. To this day, I'm not a fan of baked potatoes. When asked if I had any friends, I saw myself below deck with fellow crew members. A friend of mine was singing, I was playing harmonica, all the others joined in or just listened happily. It was a joyous scene. When asked if I had any family, my vision once again whisked me away to a little house on a large open parcel of land in what looked like the Midwest. My beautiful wife was there. She twirled in a sundress, her curly red hair bounced and swayed in the breeze. I opened a locket that I had around my neck and saw a picture of me, my wife, and my young daughter. As soon as I saw the picture of my daughter, I could see her standing in front of me on the porch with my wife. The scene had me overcome with emotion. The love a father feels for his daughter is a powerful thing, and it's something I hadn't felt before in this life. It was so powerful that I was moved to tears. Finally, I was taken to the scene of my death. After all the necessary series of calming suggestions had been given, I was once again viewing myself on the USS Mississippi. As I tightened the bolt on the starboard side of the forward gun turret, I heard the engine of a plane approaching. I barely had time to look up to see a kamikaze slam into the starboard side right above me. The explosion lodged shrapnel in my forehead and the blast sent me careening overboard. I was only barely able to gather my senses in the water in order to witness a tiger shark approaching. It's worth mentioning that I have a splotchy birthmark on my forehead where the shrapnel hit, and also I am terrified of sharks in deep water. When I got home from this session, I discussed what I had experienced with my stepfather. Being the skeptic that he is, he decided to do some research on the things I described. I hardly believed any of it myself, yet he was able to find some information in an old naval database. The USS Mississippi was a real ship. It had indeed been hit by a kamikaze near the forward gun turret on the starboard side. Several crew members were killed during the attack.
I've had my own experiences too. I lived in a suburb of Newark, New Jersey, in a house which I remember in detail, with a man who I was in a relationship with, as well as several other people. I can describe my bedroom, the daybed that I slept on, which I loved because it was just high enough that I could look out the window into the yard and enjoy the sun on my face, the closet with clothes spilling out of it. I had been taking downers for years at that point, since high school when a friend of mine had first convinced me to do them. I had continued my friendship with that person, but I had a lot of animosity towards them because of it, and I held them at arm's length because I felt that they couldn't be trusted. I remember that I really enjoyed feeling soft things when I was high, and I was feeling a scarf on the afternoon that I took too many pills. I realized what was happening to me before I lost consciousness, but there was nothing I could do, and I died. At around 3 or 4, I developed a tremendous amount of anxiety centered around taking pills, knowing how many I had taken and accidentally taking too much. I struggle with this phobia to this day, and I recognize people in that life for who they are in this life, down to patterns, repeated behaviors, and addictions. So not only does this include me, but it includes other people that I recognized while I was having this experience. The fact that there is so much to all of this is what is so unsettling, because concepts like reincarnation, past lives, and out-of-body experiences are all so commonly refuted with strawman arguments, despite this wealth of knowledge being publicly available and right under our noses. Nobody within the mainstream wants to ask the question, so we will. What if they're all right? What if we can escape our bodies? What if we go somewhere when we die and then come back, sometimes scarred by our experiences? What if, with the right techniques, we can remember those lives and learn from them, and that's the next step in human evolution? What if?
You may recall that I mentioned 3 different lives were to be revealed during my hypnosis session. As it turns out, one of them was the continuation of the life where my mother died and left me all alone. After being taken in and subsequently exiled by a traveling caravan of gypsy-type nomads, I found myself wandering through the desert, starving and near death. I came upon a city that looked something like biblical Jerusalem, although I can't really be sure. I was wearing a white cloak with blue stripes and leaning heavily on a knotted walking stick as I entered the city. With no money, no strength, and little prospects, I was caught stealing a loaf of bread. Sadly, the times in which I lived were rather barbaric, and because of my theft, I was unpleasantly stoned to death. In this life, it is very important to me that I always have enough food and water, taking both with me wherever I go. The last life revealed in this particular hypnosis session is a tale for another time, because it will bring us into stranger territory still. If anything, my experiences, and the experiences of countless others, plus the research done by Ian Stevenson, ought to be enough to convince most that past lives and reincarnation are indeed very real. And yet every web search done will invariably lead to statements such as rejected, discredited, and debunked. Isn't it funny how every paranormal topic seems to have been debunked? It's healthy to have some skepticism, yet one must consider all the information available and then ask oneself, what is really going on here? Coming up in our next episode, we've covered past lives, but what about what happens in between? Do we have a soul, and where does it go? What happens when it doesn't want to leave? Stay tuned for episode 3, where we will explore hauntings and ghosts.
Paranormalcy is produced and co-written by Matthew Miglorisi and Sarah O'Shea. We produce our own music and our own art. To support our work, please visit our website in the link below, where you can contribute to our crowdfunding, purchase the Paranormalcy book, and enjoy our art and music. We encourage you to reach out to us and share your own paranormal experiences. Our email address can be found on our website and in the link below. We would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.